Hi, I'm Marcin Marszałek, and I want to talk to you about digital rights management. To begin with, I want to stress that the term itself creates a semantic problem because different industries will use the word differently to mean something slightly different. So, for example, in the world of music, movies, or games, it will mean something different than it means to operating systems and other software. And that is in part because no one body defines the term, and it is still such a new term that it has not yet differentiated itself enough in the general body of literature to stress those differences by using different terms for it. Well, so what is DRM? Well, other people will say that it is copy protection, copy control, or copy prevention, as well as more recently digital locks. And when you think about it as copy protection, DRM intends to limit copying. However, that is not completely the whole truth. This was more of the case in previous years when people concern themselves with physical objects. If you would buy a CD or a DVD, it would intend to limit, your ability to copy it and sell it. In the digital environment, in the completely digital environment, DRM intends to limit copying, but also access to digital content. Um, and officially, it is used to protect the rights of authors, artists, creators, programmers, publishers, whoever. And that is true. However, it creates a number of other issues, and I will get back to those later. But first, I should backtrack a little bit and explain how DRM works. So DRM adds an extra layer of protection around a file, and it does so by embedding extra code, which needs a key, or a license to unlock it. And in that way, it limits, the people's access to copying music, ebooks, movies, and software. Okay, so to give you a short history of digital rights management, back in the mid 1970s, the first personal computer success story was the Altair 8800, and a company that you might have heard of called Microsoft created an operating system to run the computer called Altair Basic. Um, However, because of the limitations of the time, they had to use punch tapes to record to record the software. And the thing with punch tapes is that they're very easy to copy. Somebody with just a copying machine or a punching machine could very easily create a number of copies of them, and that is exactly what happened. And that did not sit well with Bill Gates, who wrote an open letter to hobbyists in 1976. And to quote a couple paragraphs from it, as the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Hardware must be paid for, but software is something to share. And that creates, to Bill Gates, it created the problem of preventing good software from being written. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? What hobbyist can put 3 man-years into programming, finding all bugs, documenting his product, and distribute for free? The fact is, no one besides us has invented a lot of money in a hobby software. And it is hard to argue with Mr. Gates because people stole his software. But as I said, you couldn't really do anything with punch tapes. However, as soon as floppy disks came around, there were other ways to install copy protection on the disks and on the programs and the video games even. So some of the ways that was done was by use of paraphrases, code wheels, puzzle solving, code sheets, and in the 1990s CD keys. Dongles were interesting because they were pieces of hardware that you had to plug into your computer before you could run programs, and they were mostly used for really high-end programs. In the recent years, with the rise of online gaming and downloading of music, companies like iTunes and Origin and Steam would create a fully downloadable products, which imposed new sets of DRMs. And one of the effects of those DRMs is that you do not fully own, or you do not really own, the items you buy, the songs you download from iTunes, or the games you buy and download from Steam or Origin, or in the cloud, and you do not have the full possession of them. You cannot resell them if you ever beat them or become bored. And so that was a very short history of DRM. But to move on to its pros and cons, DRM helps protect intellectual property from being stolen, and it helps transfer content only to authorized consumers. Um, and supposedly, and I am a bit wary about putting this here, you get complete product support since hundreds of man-hours were put into the creation of software, and since a company employs a number of programmers that are supposed to fix bugs and whatnot, they are in charge of making sure that the software you buy is operational. That is not always the case, but we can still consider that a pro. Moving on to cons, DRM might prevent the possibility of making backup copies of software. It definitely prevents lending of materials. If you do not have a physical copy of, say, a book, you have an ebook, you cannot always lend it to somebody unless, say, you have a Kindle and you lend your Kindle to somebody. And with the video games, say for Steam or for Origin, you definitely cannot lend those to anybody after you're done with them. And it also limits materials for research education, and that creates an interesting conundrum with fair use doctrine. To continue with cons, it might potentially create a situation where you have to pay twice for the same product. What's happened to me once was that when I bought a computer with Windows, which then needed formatting, I was left without a copy of Windows, and Windows had told me to buy a new copy, and I did not want to do that, so I moved to Linux, but that's a separate story. It also limits having the same material on multiple devices because of silos. So to recap, there were two generations of DRM. The first one limited itself to physical copies and to copying of those physical objects, I should say, and the second generation set limits on access to legally obtained materials. So what is the relevance of DRM to libraries or museums of archives? Well, to me, there are two ways you can look at it. One is the lending of materials, and the other is with programming software. So with lending, it can be very useful to libraries because it controls access to materials through inscription and watermarking. If you have a museum and you post images or pictures of your artifacts, you can impose a watermark on it, and that way it is the image is always linked to your institution. And also in the world of libraries, say with ebooks, you can lend ebooks out, and the encryption that is put into that file, into the ebook file, will ensure that it expires by itself and the patron loses access to it after a set period of time. However, on the downside, DRM can severely limit coding, and that is where open software or open source software becomes a viable alternative. So, as early as the late 70s or early 80s, the GNU project was born by a gentleman by the name of Richard Stallman, who really did not like proprietary software. And by the early 1990s, Linux operating system was born, and that became a competitor to Windows. And Linux lets all its users, everybody that has a copy of it, change anything in its coding, which is something that Windows does not. You cannot access the source code for Windows and tweak it or make it more tailored to your needs. So Linux can be a very good alternative, and because it is open source, you can do that. And what lets you do that is copyleft, which is obviously a play on copyright. So open source software is not public domain, because in the public domain somebody could take an open source program, tweak it, and then sell it as proprietary. What copyleft does is that it uses the copyright rule to set limits on it, which say anybody can have full access to any open source program, and they can tweak it as much as they want. They can change it into something completely different. However, they are tied by those same rules, which means that they have to make it fully available to anybody else to tweak it and keep going. So the appeal of open source software made the whole city of Munich moved completely to open source, which is something they completed in I think November of last year, and they are not tied to Windows anymore, to proprietary software. And that was a huge task of moving something like 15,000 personal computers and restructuring their whole IT system, and it supposedly saved them money. However, that is not why you want to move to open software. Open software lets you do things that proprietary software does not, and that is why Munich decided to move towards Linux, which is actually what they called Linux. So so all these things make DRM change and constantly evolve. iTunes made some DRM free songs available. There are sites like GOG.com or GOG, which lets you buy DRM free games. Um, but by and large, DRM is probably not something that goes away, and it creates a number of ethical issues. Do you really own the materials you buy? You do not. You cannot resell it. You cannot modify it. So it creates a problem of the fair use doctrine. And to wrap up, questions that interest me and they might interest you as well is DRM an answer to piracy, and does it create more problem than it solves? And also, what is the future of DRM? Because we are moving towards digital, fully online cloud computing, will we forget the idea of ownership, and we will just concern ourselves with the idea of access? As long as I have access to the information and the materials that I want and I need, is that enough? Will that replace ownership, and will it become irrelevant?